For much of human history, war was perhaps brutal, but it was cheap. Not morally, but logistically cheap. Armies were made up of the men already available. Weapons were mostly the tools at hand. Campaigns were seasonal, short-lived, limited by geography and famine. Kings needed loyalty, horses, and time to wage war, not accountants. Then an invention changed everything. Gunpowder not only made war more destructive, it made it expensive. And when war became expensive, it ceased to be a test of courage and became a test of finance. Before gunpowder, power was fragmented. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of lords, vassals, and necessity. Armies were temporary. Peasants gathered, fought, and were sent home for the harvest. Knights provided their own armor. Castles were for defense, not expansion. War had natural limits, because it relied on people who still had to live. No treasury could sustain endless conflicts, because it didn't have to. If a ruler went too far, armies would disintegrate, supplies would run out, and loyalty would crumble. The system was self-limiting, bigoted to falar. Gunpowder arrived in Europe quietly, in the late Middle Ages. At first, it didn't seem very impressive. Primitive cannons were unreliable. Early firearms were slow and inaccurate. The traditional elite dismissed them as noisy oddities. They were wrong, but the reason wasn't what most people thought. Gunpowder was important, not because it killed knights, but because it killed war cheaply. Cannons changed siege warfare overnight. Stone walls that had protected cities for centuries crumbled under constant bombardment. Fortifications had to be redesigned, thicker, lower, angled. This meant engineers, materials, time, and money. Firearms transformed armies. While training a knight could take a lifetime, training a musketeer was possible in months. Of course, that's if you had the money to afford the weapons, the gunpowder, the supply chain, and the constant need for resupply. Wars were no longer fought with what soldiers carried on their backs, but with what states could provide to the front. Warfare ceased to be local and became industrial. Standing armies replaced feudal militias. Soldiers were no longer occasional fighting farmers, but professionals expecting pay year-round. Armies didn't disband after campaigns. They remained, trained, and consumed resources even in peacetime. Victory no longer went to the bravest, but to those who could keep paying. This was the moment when power began to centralize. Local lords couldn't afford cannons. Small kingdoms couldn't maintain castles. Feudal obligations were insufficient to finance constant warfare. In this new reality, only centralized states with predictable incomes could survive. Gunpowder didn't just defeat castles. It defeated decentralized too. And when rulers realized that war now required money, they faced a new problem. Where would they find it? Temporary taxes were insufficient. Emergency funds couldn't sustain standing armies. So states did something radical. They normalized taxation. What was once occasional became constant. What was once negotiable became accepted reality. Now subjects were no longer indebted only for loyalty. They were also indebted for money. But even that wasn't enough. The gunpowder wars were enormous, long-lasting, and relentless. The cost of cannons, gunpowder, fortifications, ships, and soldiers exceeded what taxes alone could cover. Governments turned to borrowing. This is where the story truly enters the financial system. States adopted borrowing not as a last resort, but as a strategy. Bonds financed wars. Credit became a weapon. Bankers and financiers embraced the nobility as the king's most important allies. A ruler who could borrow, while not necessarily more popular, could wage war longer. War was no longer limited to men. It was limited only to crude. This changed everything. Because wars could be financed, they could now be prolonged beyond the public's endurance. Costs could be spread over decades. Losses could be postponed. Inflation could silently absorb some of the burden. The entire population could be financially mobilized without ever setting foot on the battlefield. Here lies the origin of the modern state. Perpetual taxation, standing armies, public debt, centralized authority. None of these were invented from abstract theory. They were all invented because gunpowder made warfare too expensive to wage the old-fashioned way. The human cost of this change was enormous. Peasants paid higher taxes. Wages lagged behind prices. Inflation eroded savings. Debts outlived kings and were inherited by generations who never voted for war, or even lived through that era. Yet the system survived. Because it worked. Gunpowder reshaped the cost of war. And in doing so, it forever redefined the relationship between money and power. Today, modern warfare is no longer limited by manpower. It is limited by budgets, aircraft carriers, satellites, cyber systems, and logistical networks. These are financial commitments as much as military ones. Just as in the age of gunpowder, the question is not who fights best, but who has the money to keep fighting. The truly disturbing reality is that limitation rarely comes solely from morality. It comes from cost. When cost is absorbed, deferred, or concealed through finance, containment weakens. This doesn't mean war is inevitable. It means it's structural. It lives within systems designed to sustain it. And as long as those systems exist, the relationship between money and violence will remain close, even if the battlefield feels distant. That's why discussions about debt, inflation, and public finances can never be separated from discussions about power. These aren't abstract economic concepts. They are the tools that allow states to project power without collapsing. They are the legacy of that brutal lesson Gunpowder taught rulers. Whoever controls the finances controls the resilience. Understanding this doesn't require cynicism, it requires realism. So when people ask why governments borrow so much, why military budgets feel permanent, why inflation silently erodes savings, or why wars seem detached from daily life, the answer isn't hidden in the latest news. The answer is buried centuries ago in that moment when technology made violence too expensive to manage through informal means. Gunpowder didn't just change war. It also changed what power needs to exist. The lesson here isn't that technology is dangerous or that finance is corrupt. It's that systems evolve around the costs they have to absorb. When those costs become large enough, they reshape everything upstream. Institutions, money, and the lives lived within them. History may not repeat itself, but it rhymes with a relentless consistency. When technology raises the price of power, money steps in to bridge the gap. And once that bridge is built, it rarely collapses.